logistics are cut off, that plays into this thing, that it plays into the psychological part of war, when an army is pretty easy to collapse if you do those sorts of things.
Hi, as ever, welcome, Chip. What's your latest up-to-date thoughts tonight on the state of the war on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, there's really not that much change on the ground, and I think we're almost getting to the point where the Russian forces culminate. Now, culmination from a military perspective is when your offensive power has been exhausted and you can go no further. That is a critical moment which would allow Ukraine at a place and time of its own choosing to go on the offensive. Now, I don't think the weather allows that to happen at the moment. It may be that certain other battles will need to be extended at Bakhmut along that part of the line to enable that to occur. But it seems to me that Ukraine are holding the line, and the task and purpose, the hold is a mission verb, that's the task, and the purpose of that is to finally blunt the Russian offensive to allow the conditions where Ukraine can take the offensive.
Yes.
And that really plays in, I think, John, to the deep strike we saw today in Crimea, because the difference really between the Russian deep strike is that the Russian deep strike focuses on the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine to try and break the will of the civilians.
Yes.
Hasn't worked in the first winter and won't. Whereas the Ukrainian deep battle focuses on degrading the military potential of Russia and therefore setting the conditions for counterattacks, including in that region. The attack in Crimea would be to come through probably Zaporizhia and sever the land corridor between the forces in Kherson and those to the east of that.
Right, and would you see this as a precursor to a Ukraine push into Crimea, which is of course part of Ukraine, but which was seized back in 2014, and where Russia has vested so much importance?
It is certainly a shaping operation, and the significance of the location which was hit today, which was Hankov, is essentially it's noughts and crosses. It's the cross, and the center of the cross leads down in one direction to Sevastopol and the resupply to the Russian fleet, and it leads up on the two upper branches of the cross to the resupply of the forces at Kherson and Zaporizhia. So it's a key logistic hub, a clever move by the Ukrainians, and it's the sustaining of that in terms of knocking out the logistics of the Russians, which is crucial. And the difference really between the Russians and the Ukrainians is that Russia is still fighting an attritional war, and all that does is force the other side to go back on its supplies. Where when Ukraine counterattacks, and indeed we saw this in the way it did its business in Kherson and Kharkiv, they understand how great generals win, and you don't win by force-on-force attacks. You win by exploiting a flank and going deep, and therefore cutting an enemy off from his logistics. So in terms of the generalship we've seen so far, it's been far superior at the moment from the Ukrainians over the Russians.
And what you're saying about the possibility of the Russian forces running out of energy and momentum makes sense of what we're hearing from NATO today, which is an intelligence assessment that Russia, in that meeting in Moscow between Vladimir Putin and President Xi, are seeking lethal aid from China. Now, that's maybe no surprise, but equally supplying that aid for China would be a difficult decision. They're in a dilemma on that. They want to strike more of a balance, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, what we saw coming out today, of course, was really just trade and economic cooperation deals between China and Russia. And it's Beijing's calculation is obviously always based really on what's best for Beijing, not what's best for Putin. So it's weighing the long-term benefits versus the risk of economic and political sanctions from the West. And we always need to remember that there are 600 million people in China who only have $100 a day, $100 a month in terms of their wage. And Xi always fears really civil strife. Feeding those people and keeping them content is something he needs to do. So all this stuff about no limits to the relationship between Russia and China is good polemicism, but it's not really the reality of what would occur in the future.
Yes, another report now concerning the east of Ukraine. Evgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the mercenary army, the Wagner Group, has publicly warned the Defense Ministry of Russia that the Ukrainians are about to launch an offensive to cut the Wagner forces off from the main Russian army in the east, as I say, of Ukraine. Could you just explain the significance of that?
Well, there's two parts. This really comes into this the maneuver force that I mentioned about how great generals win. So the first thing we can say here is that if the Battle of Bakhmut means that the offensive part of certainly the Wagner force around that area, and further south the VDV forces, the airborne forces that are attacking around Valadiva, if they have culminated, that gives the ideal time with the resources which the Ukrainians have mustered to go on the offensive. And they're not helped by the Russians in the close battle. That's the force on force that is happening in the east there, being short of artillery. And that is partly to do with the indigenous industry not being able to get that sort of stuff because of the export controls and the technical shortage on semiconductors and things like that. So, if his logistics are cut off, that plays into this thing, that it plays into the psychological part of war, when an army is pretty easy to collapse if you do those sorts of things. Yes. Essentially, it's what the Germans did at Blitzkrieg to the French in May 1940.
Yeah, so it's worth noting against that background, the new report that the Ukrainians have been promised 1 million rounds of ammunition by their allies in the European Union.
Well, I think it's slightly wider than that. So you've got the 1 million rounds from the EU promised this year, but on the 24th of February, there was a further 1 million rounds promised by the Americans in that tranche of kit that they're giving. So that's 2 million rounds over the next year. Now, of course, you need a benchmark to know what that actually means. And the benchmark for me is that 5 batteries, a couple of regiments of guns, consumed or had brought forward 150,000 rounds for the final battles around the hills of Port Stanley in 1982. So 2 million rounds sounds a lot of rounds, and it is a lot of rounds, but it's a big front. So you need to know where you want to break through, because trying to use that many rounds over a 1,200 kilometer front won't work. So you need to be absolutely clear where you want an operational level decision for that artillery to be best used.
All right. Well, I'm John Pienaar, and if you found that interesting, we are here each day, Monday to Thursday, 5 o'clock till 7 o'clock on Drive, and from 7 till 8, Pienaar and Friends, where we discuss the big stories of the day each day on Times Radio.